Samson's story does not begin with strength. It begins with a promise. Long before he ever tore apart a lion with his bare hands, before his name struck fear into the hearts of the Philistines, Samson was chosen before he took his first breath. In a time when Israel was broken and oppressed, God intervened in an impossible situation. A barren woman received a divine message. Her son would be set apart from birth, dedicated to God under the Nazarite vow. He would not drink wine. He would not touch what was unclean, and a razor would never touch his hair. But here is the truth most people misunderstand. Samson's power was never stored in his muscles, and it was never hidden in his hair. His strength came from a covenant, a living relationship between God and a man chosen for a purpose greater than himself. The hair was only a sign, a symbol of obedience. As long as that covenant remained intact, Samson carried strength no army could match. And yet, this is where the story becomes unsettling. Because being chosen does not make someone immune to failure. Being gifted does not protect the heart from desire. Samson was set apart by God, but he was still human, capable of pride, temptation, and devastating mistakes. This is not just a story about physical power. It is a story about calling, weakness, and what happens when someone confuses God's gift with personal invincibility. In the next moments, you will see how a man marked by divine purpose slowly drifted toward his downfall, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet space where trust meets temptation, and how one decision would change everything. If you want to understand why the strongest man in the Bible fell, and what his story still warns us about today, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us until the end. This story is more than ancient history, it is a mirror. The promise that shaped Samson's life was never meant to make him untouchable. From the moment he was set apart under the Nazarite vow, his strength flowed from a sacred bond with God, not from confidence in himself. Yet as Samson, that distinction slowly blurred in his own mind. Victory after victory reshaped how he saw the world, and more dangerously, how he saw himself. The same power that lifted him above ordinary men began to whisper a quiet lie that he could walk closer to the edge. Without falling, Samson's greatest battles were not fought with clenched fists or raised weapons. They unfolded in moments when desire spoke louder than discipline. Again and again, he found himself drawn toward what was forbidden, convincing himself that his calling could withstand any compromise. Each time he stepped beyond the boundaries set for him, nothing seemed to happen. The strength remained. The victories continued, and so he learned the wrong lesson. He began to believe that God's gift was unconditional, that his actions no longer carried weight, that consequences were for weaker men. Impulsiveness shaped many of his choices. When Samson wanted something, he moved toward it without hesitation, trusting his instincts more than the purpose that had defined his life from the beginning. He followed attraction instead of wisdom, emotion instead of restraint, telling himself that everything could still be turned toward a greater plan. Even when those closest to him expressed concern, he pressed forward, convinced that his strength would carry him through any outcome. What he failed to see was that each impulsive decision quietly weakened the foundation beneath him, not by removing his strength, but by eroding his awareness of where that strength truly came from. Overconfidence was the final thread woven into his downfall. Samson had faced enemies no one else dared to confront, and each time he emerged victorious, the distance between divine power and personal pride grew smaller in his mind. He began to rely on what had always worked before, assuming that the presence of God would follow him automatically. Trust slowly shifted from obedience to habit, from faith to familiarity. He no longer guarded the sacred boundaries of his calling, because he believed they could not be breached. What makes Samson's struggle so unsettling is how subtle it was. There was no sudden rebellion, no dramatic rejection of his purpose. Instead, there was a gradual drift, a quiet confidence that grew into carelessness. He did not lose his strength when he first ignored a warning or crossed a line. He lost something far more dangerous: his sensitivity to danger itself. By the time true betrayal entered his life, his defenses were already weakened. Not because he lacked power, but because he believed power alone was enough. Samson's story reveals a painful truth: extraordinary ability does not cancel human vulnerability. In fact, it often amplifies it. The stronger he became outwardly, the less guarded he grew inwardly. Desire, impulsiveness, and overconfidence did not destroy him all at once. They guided him step by step toward a moment where he would finally mistake closeness for safety and trust for certainty. And when that moment arrived, the strength he had always depended on could no longer protect him from the consequences of a heart that had slowly drifted away from its source. By the time Delilah entered Samson's life, the ground beneath him was already unstable. His victories had made him famous, but they had also made him predictable. The Philistine leaders understood something crucial. Samson could not be defeated by soldiers or weapons. Every direct confrontation had ended in humiliation. If they were going to bring him down, they needed a different kind of strategy, one that did not challenge his strength but quietly moved around it. That is where Delilah came in. Delilah did not approach Samson as an enemy. She did not threaten him, trap him, or attempt to overpower him. She offered something far more disarming: closeness. In a world where Samson was constantly watched, hunted, and feared, Delilah created a space where he could lower his guard. Whether she was driven by greed, pressure, or personal ambition, she understood her role with unsettling clarity. The Philistine leaders did not ask her to fight Samson. They asked her to listen, to observe, and to wait. The offer they placed before her was not small. Each leader promised a reward great enough to change her life permanently. Wealth, security, and influence stood on one side, while loyalty to a dangerous man stood on the other. The text does not tell us whether fear played a role, but the reality of her position is hard to ignore. Living between hostile powers, surrounded by people who wanted Samson destroyed, refusal may have carried its own risks. Whatever her motivation, Delilah chose alignment with power over allegiance to trust. Her method was patience. Delilah never demanded answers. She asked questions that sounded harmless, framed curiosity as affection, and disappointment as emotional pain. She allowed Samson to feel in control, even as she slowly reshaped the direction of their conversations. Each request was presented as proof of love. Each hesitation turned into evidence of distance. She did not rush because she understood that true influence is rarely sudden. It is built through repetition. Samson, already weakened by overconfidence, mistook persistence for devotion. He had survived danger his entire life, and this danger felt different because it wore a familiar face. Delilah's power did not lie in deception alone, but in her ability to exploit what Samson already believed, that his strength made him untouchable. Each time he tested her with false answers and survived, his confidence grew. He assumed that exposure carried no cost, that even truth itself could not harm him. What makes Delilah's role so tragic is how calculated it was. She did not act in the heat of passion or desperation. She watched, learned, and adjusted. When one attempt failed, she changed her approach, not with anger, but with emotional pressure. She understood that exhaustion breaks defenses more effectively than force. And when Samson finally spoke the truth, it was not because he trusted her completely, but because he was tired of resisting. In the end, Delilah did not steal Samson's strength. She uncovered the place where it had already begun to slip away. Her betrayal succeeded not because she was stronger, but because she knew where he was weakest. She became the final instrument in a plan that relied on emotional manipulation rather than violence, proving that the most dangerous enemies are not always those who stand against us openly, but those who sit close enough to hear what we are not ready to protect. Samson did not fall in a single moment, and that truth is essential to understanding his story. His downfall unfolded slowly, shaped by choices he made while fully aware of the risks. Each warning sign appeared clearly before him, yet he stepped past it with confidence, telling himself that control was still firmly in his hands. This was not ignorance, but familiarity with danger, and familiarity had taught him the wrong lesson. He believed survival proved wisdom. After each attempt to uncover his secret, Samson saw the pattern forming. He recognized the betrayals as they happened, understood their implications, and still chose to remain. His strength had carried him through worse, and so he treated these moments as tests rather than alarms. What mattered most was not that Delilah tried again and again, but that Samson allowed it. He reframed suspicion as affection, interpreting persistence as concern rather than threat, and in doing so, he made himself complicit in his own unraveling. There was a rhythm to the cycle. Delilah would press him for answers. Disappointment would follow, and Samson would offer another false solution. Each time, he watched the outcome closely, measuring the consequences. When nothing happened, his confidence deepened. He told himself that if danger were real, he would feel it immediately. Instead, he felt untouched, reinforced by the belief that his strength was not something that could be taken from him by words alone. This illusion of control became his greatest weakness. What Samson failed to recognize was the cost of constant resistance. Strength protected his body, but it did nothing to guard his emotional endurance. Day after day, the same conversation returned, reshaped but never resolved. Delilah did not need to overpower him. She needed only to persist. Emotional exhaustion works quietly, draining clarity and replacing it with the desire for relief. Samson did not reveal his secret because he trusted her more, but because he could no longer sustain the effort of refusing. By the time he spoke, the boundary between defiance and surrender had blurred. The secret that defined him no longer felt sacred. It felt heavy. Samson convinced himself that honesty would end the conflict, restore peace, and prove that his confidence was justified. He believed that even if his secret were known, he would remain the same man. This final assumption sealed his fate, because it confused strength with permanence. The tragedy lies not in betrayal alone, but in Samson's awareness of it. He was not blindsided or deceived without warning. He saw the danger clearly, measured it repeatedly, and chose to gamble against it. Each successful escape reinforced his belief that consequences could always be delayed, that control meant the ability to recover. He underestimated the power of repetition, the way pressure accumulates not through force, but through time. When the secret was finally revealed, the collapse felt sudden only because the warning signs had been ignored for so long. The fall was not a surprise. It was the conclusion of a process already underway. Samson's story becomes a cautionary tale not about strength lost in an instant, but about discipline eroded over time. His downfall reminds us that control is not proven by how often we escape consequences, but by whether we recognize when escape is no longer the victory we think it is. When Samson's hair was finally cut, the loss he experienced was deeper than physical weakness. What left him in that moment was not merely strength, but the presence that had always sustained it. For the first time in his life, Samson rose expecting the familiar surge of power and felt nothing. The silence was immediate and disorienting. Strength had never been something he questioned before. It had answered him every time. Now, there was only absence. And in that absence, the truth became unavoidable. His capture followed quickly, not because his enemies had suddenly become stronger, but because the foundation beneath him had vanished. Samson had lived as though power were permanent, as though divine favor could be stretched without limit. When he crossed the final boundary, he discovered that the covenant he had treated lightly was the very source of his identity. The physical act of cutting his hair symbolized a spiritual separation already underway, the visible sign of an inner breach that had been forming long before that night. Blindness came next, and with it, a forced stillness he had never known, deprived of sight, movement, and freedom. Samson entered a world where strength no longer defined him. The man who once acted on impulse was now confined to reflection. Every step he took in captivity echoed with memory, reminding him of who he had been and how easily he had assumed that role could never be taken away. Humiliation replaced admiration, and silence replaced celebration. Yet within that humiliation, something began to change. Stripped of external power, Samson encountered himself without illusion. The strength he had relied upon had masked his dependence, allowing him to believe he stood alone. Now, powerless, he recognized that he never had. His suffering became a teacher, revealing what abundance had concealed. The presence he had taken for granted was no longer felt, but it was remembered, and that memory carried weight. Time passed slowly in captivity, and with time came understanding. Samson's hair began to grow again, but more important was the growth taking place within him. This was not a return to former confidence, but a deeper awareness of where true power had always come from. His awakening was painful, shaped by regret and loss, yet it was honest. For the first time, he no longer confused calling with entitlement or strength with permission. The final chapter of Samson's life did not restore him to the man he once was. It transformed him into someone else entirely. His renewed dependence was no longer rooted in pride, but in humility. When he called out one last time, it was not to prove his power, but to acknowledge its source. The presence he had lost was no longer assumed, but sought. Samson's story ends not with triumph as he once understood it, but with clarity. His downfall exposed the cost of neglecting the sacred. Yet his awakening revealed that restoration was still possible, even after failure. Strength returned, but only after he learned that it was never his to command. In losing everything, Samson finally understood the truth that had been present since his birth. Power without presence is empty. And presence, once recognized, changes everything. Samson's story does not end in defeat, but in meaning. His final act was not driven by rage, pride, or a desire for revenge, but by surrender. For the first time, Samson no longer relied on what he could do. He relied on who God was. Standing in weakness, he recognized that everything he had lost had brought him to this moment of clarity. The strength he once assumed was his own now returned only after he let go of control completely. In that final prayer, Samson did not ask to reclaim his former life or restore his reputation. He asked for strength one last time, not to elevate himself, but to fulfill the purpose he had been given from the beginning. It was an act of repentance rooted in humility. He acknowledged his dependence openly, accepting the cost of obedience without negotiation. This surrender marked the true transformation of his character, turning a life marked by impulsiveness into a moment defined by faith. The strength that followed was unmistakably divine. It was not a reward for perfection, but a response to repentance. Samson's final act became one of self-sacrifice, where his life was offered to complete a mission larger than himself. In that moment, he achieved what years of unchecked power had failed to accomplish. Israel was delivered not through spectacle, but through obedience born from brokenness. This ending reframes the entire story. Samson was never meant to be remembered only as the strongest man in the Bible, but as a reminder that true power flows from alignment with God's will. His failures were real and costly, yet they did not erase his calling. Instead, they shaped the path through which redemption became possible. His life teaches that purpose is not cancelled by failure, but fulfilled through surrender. Samson's legacy is complex, but deeply human. He fell slow, learned painfully, and returned humbly. His final act stands as a testament that redemption is not about reclaiming what was lost, but about offering what remains. In giving his life, Samson completed his mission and left behind a lesson that echoes beyond his time. Strength without submission leads to ruin, but surrender restores meaning. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you found value in this journey through Samson's life, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more in-depth biblical storytelling and reflection. Your support helps keep these stories alive, explored with care, depth, and purpose.